I just want to thank all the first group of fellows. Those were wonderful presentations. And as you can hear what Jennifer said, we really hope that that these presentations sort of encourage discussions among the fellows and among sort of mentors with their fellows. We don't have a lot of time for that today, but that's sort of, you know, what the chat is about and what the Jamboard is about. Just a reminder, if you're not presenting, please mute your microphone. Alex, nice job dealing with that distraction. You flowed right through it, but let's not ask our fellows to do that. They got enough on their minds. Kendall will also drop into the chat the new Jamboard that we're going to be using. So each set of fellows essentially has their own Jamboard. So you can see that Kendall has dropped that in there. And you can see part of what we're doing here is actually multitasking, right? We want you to listen to the presentation, put some questions in chat, and make some comments on sticky notes as well. And hopefully that's keeping you engaged, and hopefully it's going to be useful for the fellows moving forward. All right, so without further ado, we'll start our second round, and we'll hear from Camille Francis, who's been working with the Burlington, Vermont Electric Department. Camille, over to you.
Hi, thank you, Cameron. So hi, everyone. My name is Camille, and I'm the UNH Sustainability Fellow for the Burlington Electric Department. The Burlington Electric Department, or BED, is a municipal electric department located in the city of Burlington, Vermont. In 2014, Burlington became the first city in the United States to source 100% of its electricity from renewable generation. Building on this achievement, BED recently announced its goal to transition the city to net zero energy by 2030 in the thermal and transportation sectors. This summer, I'll be working with BED to create a guide focused on electric vehicle supply equipment, or EVSE, installation in multifamily properties. In addition, I'll also be working to expand the recently launched program also focused on EVSE installation in multifamily properties. This is important because even though around 60% of BED's customers reside in multifamily properties, only a handful of chargers have been installed in these areas. This causes slower adoption of electric vehicles, and my work will hopefully help to increase the rate of adoption. Next slide, please. So what have I learned so far? I've learned a lot about electric vehicle supply equipment, such as about the complexities of the installation process and the various incentive programs that are available all over the US. I've also learned a lot about the day-to-day operations of BED. Even though I'm far away, my mentors have taken the time to make sure that I feel included, such as by inviting me to meetings in different departments and ensuring that I'm able to explore my other interests, as well as the main focus of the project, which is something that I greatly appreciate. Next slide, please. Challenges. So for me, the biggest challenge is working remotely and from a different country. I think being able to work in person would have helped me to get a better idea of the experiences of multifamily property owners, such as by visiting sites to see different installation techniques and speaking to stakeholders face-to-face. Also, I've struggled with issues related to the internet caused by a myriad of factors. Finally, I've also heard that Burlington is very beautiful, so I'd love to get the opportunity to visit. Next slide, please. So elevating social justice. I think my work will help BED to achieve its goal of ensuring that everyone in the transportation sector has access to clean energy. As was mentioned before, only a handful of chargers have been installed in multifamily properties. This is an issue of equity, as persons who live in these properties are mostly renters, a group that is largely made up of low to moderate income families. This work is important to me because, especially as someone from an underrepresented group, I'm passionate about ensuring that everyone has access to clean energy resources, regardless of their socioeconomic status. Thank you.
Thank you, Camille. That was fantastic. Any questions for Camille? You can just drop them in the chat. I'll ask you one just quickly. Are you optimistic or pessimistic that we'll see a significant uptick in EV charger installations in multifamily homes in Burlington? Do you think there's a good foundation there, or are you concerned?
I think there definitely is a good foundation, and I think there is a lot of interest in the installation of chargers in multifamily properties. I definitely think that there is more work to be done, but I think because of the level of interest, we do have people in Burlington who are willing to put in the work.
Great, thank you.
And this is based on my conversation with property owners and landlords as well.
I'll also mention that it's our distinct hope that that many of you can visit the sites where you're virtually working but not in person working, and so that's something that we hope sort of in the future that we can help make those connections. And I can assure you, Burlington is a very beautiful place.
I've heard many times.
One last question from Kat. How do you see this work as plausible in the Caribbean based on how you've seen this work up in Burlington?
Okay, so the Caribbean is a very diverse place, and different countries have made different strides regarding electric vehicles. So for example, countries such as Barbados have made many more strides towards electric vehicle adoption in comparison to countries such as Jamaica. So there is a lot of work to be done, but it depends on the country. I know Jamaica has just started dipping its toe into electric vehicle adoption, and there have been requests for information that have been distributed and conversations that have started. And I know our Ministry of Transportation and Works has started to do some research into not only EV adoption, but also autonomous vehicle adoption. But we still have quite a bit of work that needs to be done, which has to start with upgrading our entire electrical service system. So it just depends on the country.
Great, yeah, and a big topic and a nice concise answer for a big issue. So we're going to have to move on. Thank you so much, Camille, and please remember to keep dropping comments on the Jamboard as well. Next, we're going to hear from Ariana Stokes, who's been working with the New Hampshire Commission on offshore wind and port development, which is a really significantly emerging topic here in coastal New Hampshire. So Ariana, over to you.
Thank you. Yes, so hi everyone, I'm Ariana Stokes and I'm the Sustainability Fellow with the New Hampshire Commission to study offshore wind and port development. The Commission is a public body that was established by the New Hampshire State Legislature, and the Commission is studying potential impacts of future offshore wind development here in the Gulf of Maine. Offshore wind represents an enormous opportunity for us to reduce our carbon emissions, and it's really exciting to see this opportunity potentially come to the Gulf of Maine soon. I am creating communications materials on behalf of the Commission to help educate New Hampshire audiences about the Commission's activities and to help facilitate public participation in the offshore wind development process here in the Gulf of Maine. Next slide, please. So a few underlying themes that have emerged in my work so far. I'm learning that the offshore wind industry is rapidly evolving. The industry is mature in Europe, but is just now getting started in the United States, and things are moving fast. I'm drawing upon resources that were very recently published. Things seem to be changing from year to year, if not from month to month or day to day, and that's a totally new world for me compared to the world of academia. But as you might see on this map, although activity is ramping up, there's not too much going on in the Gulf of Maine yet. And I'm learning that it pays not to go first sometimes. We don't have to reinvent the wheel here in New Hampshire. I don't have to reinvent the wheel in my communications materials. Instead, my focus is on synthesizing lessons learned from other states. And lastly, I'm realizing just how interdisciplinary the offshore wind industry is. As you can imagine, it's not an easy feat to install a large wind turbine in the ocean, and it requires the expertise of many, many different fields. And my communications materials must be just as interdisciplinary as the industry itself. Next slide, please. This work has not been without its challenges. One thing I think about quite a bit is how to convey uncertainty in my communications materials. The impacts and benefits of offshore wind development that I'm communicating about are very tentative and very much dependent on future action taken by policymakers and future public engagement. I also think about the appropriate level of scope for these materials. So I'm working on a website and a number of fact sheets for the Commission, and these materials should not and cannot be the end-all be-all source of information on offshore wind, and I have to decide what to include and what not to include, and that's a hard choice. Lastly, I think my greatest personal challenge in this work is the cognitive dissonance that results from engaging with an industry that is very much needed for our carbon emission reductions, but one that is ultimately led by large corporations that were or still are involved in fossil fuel extraction. Next slide, please. So that brings me to thinking about how to elevate social justice within an industry that is led by large corporations whose business model has driven social injustice. And I like to think about the words of climate journalist Amy Westervelt, that climate solutions are about power structures, not energy sources. So from this premise, I hope that my communication materials will have some impact on these power structures. My materials will provide greater access to information and access to opportunities for public engagement. And I think that is an important first step in making the offshore wind development process a more democratic decision-making process. I hope that these materials will enable Granite Staters to advocate for their interests and hopefully shape the development process in the Gulf of Maine to be one that prioritizes economic, racial, and climate justice. So thank you everyone for listening, and I look forward to your questions and comments and ideas. Cameron, I'm not sure if you're speaking, but you're muted, but I can filter
We have
through
time for, yes, yeah, we got, I'm sorry, we got time for just maybe one or two questions. So short answers. Jen asks, what criteria are you using to decide what to include and what not to include?
Yeah, right. So that's definitely been the challenge, and I'm trying to, prioritize my time. And if there is a source that is an expert in a particular topic, then I try to outsource to those resources and incorporate, graphics that have already been made by our federal government, by the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, and that sort of thing. And also trying to evaluate its relevance to New Hampshire versus its relevance to offshore wind in general.
Great, thank you. And then just quickly, Michael Wilson asked, so have you learned about examples of other areas responding to fishing concerns in offshore wind?
Oh, as in other states? Yeah, so I'm
states or countries.
Or countries, yeah. So I am actually focusing on the fishery content for the website right now, and I am featuring a slideshow of what other actors have done for mitigation measures. Let's see, something that I'm thinking that I have featured in that slideshow right now is Maine just passed a moratorium on future offshore wind development within state waters. So instead, moving offshore wind development to federal waters, which are further offshore, and that will help protect fishing industries. A lot of lobstering takes place in state coastal waters.
Great, thanks, Ariana. If only it was that easy in Maine. It's just the beginning of the fight. All right, a great presentation. Thanks so much. We got to move on. And I'm just going to remind everybody, drop some comments and additional questions on Jamboard. All right, next up is Mikey Prosciutto, who's going to talk about the work that he's been doing with New Hampshire businesses for social responsibility. Mikey, over to you.
Perfect. Thanks, Kim. Howdy, everybody. My name is Mikey, and I'm the NHBSR's Sustainability Fellow. My mentor is Michelle, and what we've been primarily focusing on is a climate action challenge, which is an email and discussion-based challenge for businesses, individuals, and organizations to really implement impactful climate action into their workplace. So just a little bit of background about the NHBSR. We're an organization that supports businesses and inspires them to do more and provides resources and expertise to allow them to create that lasting impact in their communities and businesses. And you may recognize some of the businesses on the right. We're over 100 members strong, and this really ties into me personally because I'm one of the companies up there, and I grew up in a small business, and I really fundamentally understand that we don't always have the bandwidth to really implement these important actions and impacts into our companies when we have a lot of other things to do. So with that, next slide. So it's been a bit of a learning curve for me because it's about integrating like holistic and intersectional view of climate action because things really do intermingle with one another. So a bit about the structure. There's 20 emails spread across 1 month, broken into 16 learning days, and these include topics like food systems, energy, climate change, and conscious consumerism. And then at the end of each week, there are 4 discussions. These are led by industry leaders, experts, advocates, who ultimately have the resources that people need to implement these actions. And I've really learned that the roots of impactful action are that people need the expertise, resources, and education presented in a digestible way to really spur that action. Because ultimately, I only have 30 minutes worth of content per subject to really keep these high-level decision makers engaged. And a little bit more on the next slide. So some of the challenges I've faced, I've felt a little bit like an art curator, kind of like organizing an exhibit where I have some of the paintings / emails done, and I'm presenting them in a way that's a nice storyboard while I'm still creating some of that content, arranging discussions at the same time. So it's a little bit difficult for me to create that flow until kind of like the 11th hour and everything's together. The other challenge I faced is crafting that narrative of climate change to climate crisis and then implementing key action. I've always wanted to keep the businesses and organizations engaged while balancing the severity of the issue without shielding people from that depressing nature of the daunting issue that's in front of us. That I found that to be a very delicate balancing act. And a little bit more on the next slide about one of the more hard balancing acts. So integrating social and climate justice. Mark Lee at the B Corp Climate Action Summit had an amazing quote where he said, "A sustainable future isn't about billionaires flying around in hydrogen-powered jets or sweatshops running off of solar power. It's just so much bigger than that." It was actually a very personal note where he talked about the failures of the B Corp Climate Collective, that they treated climate justice and climate crisis separately, which was their largest failure, because you really can't tackle the climate crisis unless you're treating your fellow men and women as equals. And that was the biggest crux, that these policies have to be lumped together. And lastly, before, just to be sensitive to time, a figure on the right is actually from one of the emails I've composed, centered around climate justice. And it goes through the different climate justice action levels that different businesses can take, whether they want to be an industry leader or they're just getting curious and starting to really get involved with their own communities. And with that, I'll move into the question / discussion portion. So thank you for listening, everybody.
Great, thank you, Mikey. And I think you've nailed one of the central challenges there. And Kat put it really nicely. It's tricky how to be realistic without being too bleak. And I've been struggling with this for 30 years. We do have time for one quick question for Mikey before we move on, if anybody has one. Going.
Thank you, Michelle.
Yeah, and I think we're all going to continue with that struggle. So we are running a little bit behind. So please post your comments, other questions for Mikey on Jamboard. And we're going to transition next to a presentation by Madeline Peary, who's been working with the Nature Conservancy. And I think Madeline gets our award today for sticking with it. She's suffering from a little bit of laryngitis. And so she might be a little slower. She's going to have to talk slowly to get this done. And hopefully she gets through it. And if not, that's going to be okay too. But I just want to say thanks for trying, Madeline.
Thanks, Cameron. So sorry if I lose my voice throughout any point of the presentation. But yeah, so this summer I have been working with the Nature Conservancy using GIS to inventory and update the database of public and conservation lands throughout the state of New Hampshire. And just to give a little bit of background, the Nature Conservancy is one of the world's leading environmental nonprofits in land conservation. And New Hampshire itself has approximately 280,000 acres of conservation lands. And it is really important for us to frequently update this database every few years over the last decade, because it helps us understand where these conservation lands are and what resources and ecosystem services they are providing us with. And it also helps local governments, research groups, nonprofits understand how these lands are changing over time, and especially how these lands are changing in the face of climate change. So this year we got submissions from 39 different land commission organizations, which is above average from previous years, and it's great. Next slide, please. Yeah, so because this project directly relates to land usage, I feel that it's necessary to take the time to give a land acknowledgement. So the work of the Nature Conservancy takes place on the past and present homelands of the Pennacook, Abenaki, and Wabanaki peoples in New Hampshire. And I'm doing my work remotely from the Anishinaabe and Potawatomi lands in Michigan. And I've provided links below and can provide them in the chat later on. And we'll speak more in depth about equity and land management momentarily. Next slide, please. Yeah, so aside from the technical work of updating land boundaries and GIS, the biggest thing that I've been learning are the specific legal mechanisms behind land management. So this includes learning the different provisions behind the access and management of these conservation lands. And to help understand these legal mechanisms, I am working closely with the organizations who have submitted these updates, really try and understand the history and purposes behind these lands as I'm working on them, and really trying to discover what my own impact is in the world of land conservation. Next slide, please. So in the beginning, like a lot of us, a lot of my challenges were trying to adjust to working in a remote environment and familiarizing myself with the previous updates of the project. And as of right now, halfway through the summer, definitely my biggest obstacle has been time management. So a lot of organizations that we've been working with have needed to have extended deadlines for their submissions, which is totally fine, and we've been working with them, but it's definitely required me to reprioritize my workload throughout the summer. And as of right now, I've completed about 7 out of 39 organization submissions, and I'm really trying to finish all 39 of them by the end of the summer. Next slide, please. Yeah, so one of the missions of the Nature Conservancy is working to create a connected landscape between nature and people and ensure that all people have equal access to nature. So you can see from these maps I've made that the majority of public and conservation lands in New Hampshire are in the northern, very rural areas of the state, but the majority of the population resides in the southern part of the state. And I'm really starting to think about the concept of land accessibility and how we can make nature and recreational activities accessible to everybody, regardless of their age, ability, socioeconomic status, or location. And this is something that I hope to explore more during the final presentation. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Madeline. Everybody, please put your questions in the chat or drop them in the Jamboard. Madeline's not going to answer them now. She's going to answer them later, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't ask them. And Madeline, great for just charging ahead and doing that. Really appreciate it. So we're going to move right along to hear from Kathleen Fletcher, who's been working with the town of Durham. Kathy, over to you.
Thanks, Cam. Hi, everyone. I'm Kathleen Fletcher, and I'm the Summer Sustainability Fellow for the town of Durham in New Hampshire. So in our current climate crisis, the lack of adequate federal and state policies means that municipalities must act to reduce and prevent the worsening effects of climate change. And the town of Durham is striving to be that necessary leader. Earlier this year, Durham joined the Global Covenant of Mayors, where they pledged to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions and track their progress moving forward. But in order to determine where to go, Durham first has to understand where they're starting from. So this summer, I am conducting a greenhouse gas inventory for land use in Durham, specifically for trees inside and outside of forests, which measures both emissions and sinks within the community. The results of this inventory will then be used by Durham to set their greenhouse gas reduction targets. In addition to this work, I'm also working to identify opportunities for greater community engagement and involvement. Next slide, please. So we're learning about the importance of collecting data relevant to our efforts. This map shows an overview of land cover change in Durham, which we can later use to calculate greenhouse gas emissions and sinks. Although this is good to know for community-wide reporting, having a breakdown of data helps guide policy decisions and develop tangible ways to reduce Durham's emissions. Also, since forests have many more inputs and variability, the overall structure of land use greenhouse gas reporting is not as straightforward as reporting for other sectors. And lastly, we are learning that we must think about our audience, which is made up of our community members, when determining how to maximize our community engagement efforts. And we're developing ways to understand our audience better through surveys and other means. Next slide. So since my project is centered around land use, learning about a community remotely has been a challenge. My mentors have done a great job in connecting me to local land use experts, and I've also utilized the town's website for a lot of information. Secondly, since a land use greenhouse gas inventory has never been done in Durham before, many decisions need to be made data-wise, and we are following a greenhouse gas inventory protocol to help guide our decisions and are continually asking ourselves what data is relevant to proceed with. And lastly, we want to ensure that the outcome of this work has its intended impact on Durham by helping Durham set their reduction targets through policy and other measures, and also set the stage to elevate community involvement. Next slide. So in this project, we are elevating social justice by increasing opportunities for public awareness, access to education, and ways to get involved. We are also creating recommendations while looking through a social justice lens. We are trying to find the balance between the importance of conserving forests versus using it for other needed land uses, and are considering how each decision would affect members of the community. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Kathy. Right on time. Wondering if there's any questions out there for Kathy. While we're waiting, Kathy, I'm going to throw something out there. In terms of the overall sinks of land use in Durham, you think it's comparable to the sources, or you think it's like half of the sources or a quarter of the sources? Do you have any sense in terms of relative amounts?
Total, like from other sectors as well?
Yeah.
So another fellow last year did a municipal greenhouse gas inventory, and I believe those emissions were about a fifth of what the sinks are in our preliminary community-wide greenhouse gas inventory so far. Another fellow did other parts of a community greenhouse gas inventory, but I haven't checked those numbers recently after doing our preliminary findings. But that's it would be interesting to see.
Right. It's well, and really useful for the region, because we do have so much forest as well as so much ocean and so much blue carbon on our coast. So it's going to be good to try and narrow this down and do it at the micro level that you're doing at. And just want to make sure you see Peter Steckler's note that there's check out New Hampshire's Coastal Watershed Conservation Plan. It'd be worth looking at. Any last question for Kathy? Again, please don't forget to post questions or ideas or notes on Jamboard. And not seeing anything, we're going to move right along to our next presentation by Natalie Roach, who's been working with Goodwill in Northern New England.
Hi everyone, my name is Natalie, and I've been working on diversity, equity, and inclusion at Goodwill of Northern New England this summer. So this organization services Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont, and it has a variety of programs, including the thrift stores you're probably familiar with, as well as healthcare, including group homes and neuro rehabilitation, job training and assistance, and even a sustainable cleaning initiative. All right, next slide, please. Great, so what are we learning this summer? Goodwill is really focused on not just checking a box with this diversity, equity, inclusion, or DEI work, but really committing to the fact that it's a, sort of forever commitment, right? This is something that we keep working on over the years. So because of that, we're really focused this summer on laying the foundation of that work, like a nice solid foundation. So that includes data collection, so surveys, focus groups, stuff like that, collecting the employee's voice, communication, so both internal and external, and then also structure, so the organizational structure of the people at the company who will continue doing that DEI work, and then all that will continue into the fall and beyond with action. Next slide, please. So the challenges. This is the first time that the organization has tried a organization-wide campaign that's really aimed at reaching every single employee and engaging them. So because of that, we're sort of learning as we go. We're learning how to do this as we're doing it. And on top of that, it's a multi-state, multi-sector organization. So there are a variety of spaces and cultures that we're trying to address at the same time. So it's a very complex organization to do this in. And then of course, as a lot of other people have mentioned, the remote work adds an extra layer where, we can't just go down and knock on someone's door and say, hey, have you looked at the survey? Or, go to a store and engage people in the process. So that's just an extra layer. Next slide, please. So lastly, so some short-term, social justice impacts is an employee feedback mechanism that is effective and genuine and really creating that culture of speaking up for employees, as well as the organizational structure. So we have people working on this in a genuine manner into the future. But overall, Goodwill pulling this off and really learning how this integration works can then have them serve as a model for sustainability organizations into the future. And to me, that is one of the biggest needs that the environmental movement has to tackle right now, is integrating DEI and social justice principles. So Goodwill can really have a super broad impact outside of their organization into the future.
All right. I'm assuming that was it, Natalie.
Yes.
Thank you so much. Again, drop your questions in the chat box. I really like the note that you ended on, Natalie, is this notion that so much of the work that we're doing and we've heard is sort of cutting edge, it's new, and that it's really important that we think about this serving as a model for other organizations. Do you have any idea on how, once you're done, Goodwill might be doing that, sort of taking that message out to other nonprofits?
So we haven't discussed it too much because we're really at that foundational level and there's still action within the own organization to prioritize. But, there are a lot of affiliate regional organizations in Goodwill to communicate with, and, I'm sure through this network as well.
Excellent. We do have a question from Kat. What DEI would you implement if you had your own organization that Goodwill may or may not do? So this is sort of a little bit of a hypothetical, but not completely.
Great question. I think I love the idea of starting a new organization because you're starting from scratch and you can really be very intentional in the way you build your organization. So I think, focusing on those initial things like, a livable wage and making, I think just that the process would be different of how we make decisions and how we really build out step by step with those social justice things in the beginning. Because I think DEI is great and that's the step that everyone's at right now, but it's even better if it's just easier and provide so much more opportunity if you can sort of start with that social justice lens. So I think more about the process than, the specific programs.
Great. Well, thank you, Natalie. And that's going to be the ongoing question, right? Do we start new or do we renovate what we have? And it's going to be a mixture of both. And but thanks for that answer. All right. Again, don't forget to drop any notes in the Jamboard for Natalie. And the last presentation in this session, Meg Maloney's has been working with the Oyster River Cooperative School District. Meg, over to you.
Thanks, Cameron. Hi, everyone. I know my presentation is the last one before the break, so I'll try and make it super engaging so we can have some time to decompress before the next set. So my name is Meg. I am working for the Oyster River Cooperative School District this summer. They are based in Durham, New Hampshire. They have 4 schools that are comprised of about 6,000 students and then 400 faculty and staff. And I am helping build a sustainability management plan for the next 5 to 10 years. Next slide. So a little bit about the work that I'm doing. A sustainability management plan looks different kind of depending on your community or what school that you're working with. So I catered one based on what the biggest needs we identified were for Oyster River, but also based on kind of what the community needs as well. So we have 7 focus areas, which you see on here. And in each focus area, we have an overall objective, a goal, and then the strategies to achieve those goals in the next 5 to 10 years. We wanted to base our plan in something concrete and then something that students could also use as a learning tool to understand a little bit more about sustainability. So we based it in a global initiative and a local initiative. The global initiative was a sustainable development goals. So each of the focus area, we have a sustainable development goal or goals that we relate back to and talk about throughout the plan. The second one is the sustainability policy that Oyster River created. We wanted to ground the plan into this because obviously it's a policy for the school district, but it also highlights kind of the work that they have been doing for the past decade that they've been working on sustainability. I've also been talking to schools across the country, researching sustainability curriculum and how they can integrate curriculum so that students can walk away after they graduate high school being really literate in sustainability, understanding kind of what it means, what climate change means, and how we can be productive in working to create a more sustainable planet. Lastly, I've been doing stakeholder engagement and creating a stakeholder plan. Obviously, with me being remote, we can't just create a sustainability plan in a vacuum. We need everyone's voices to be heard, but it's especially important we get stakeholder engagement so that they can help push this plan forward. So during the fall, after I'm finished, they will be engaging the community to kind of come around the ideas of this plan, edit it, infuse their own ideas before they finalize it. Next slide. Some of the challenges that I have been working through, first with the plan, it comes with benchmarking. So some of the targets for the focus area have been changing due to construction and other things. So it can be difficult at times to kind of set a target for them to reach that's still achievable and motivating. Stakeholder engagements, obviously difficult working remote. With curriculum, a lot of teachers are understandably burnt out from COVID. So how can we still engage sustainability curriculum without putting a lot of pressure on teachers? And lastly, communication. Communication has been identified as an area throughout the district that they have seen a need for transparency. So how can I clearly communicate my efforts in a way that everyone kind of knows what's happening? Next slide. Lastly, elevating social justice. There's some really, really amazing anti-racism work that's taking place within the school district. So we've been aligning kind of our sustainability goals with the anti-racism focus to create a whole overall social justice movement that we can incorporate within the curriculum, policy management plan, and communication strategy. I'm excited to be sharing my work to the school board on August 4th. And I've loved this opportunity and I'm excited to see how the last couple of weeks go. Thank you.
Fantastic, Meg. Totally engaging. Great presentation. It sounds like a great project and really building on some building blocks that are there. There's a couple questions. One from Yadira. Any highlights or something that stood out to you when you reached out to different schools to bounce ideas from them?
Yes, I was going to say the most interesting thing so far is like how they've been fundraising, or like not fundraising, but how they've been having the financial means to make these projects possible. School districts have been really creative with like bonds, which I knew nothing about before, and passing bonds in order to do that. They've also had really creative ways that they incorporate sustainability curriculum. Like they'll give a teacher almost like a year off to just spend time like doing curriculum development. So those were a couple things that I thought were really awesome that I have given to Oyster River as recommendations.
And the next question certainly comes from a resident of New Hampshire who knows how we fund our schools, because this is what residents ask all the time at town meetings. Are you addressing cost benefits with your work since voters ultimately approve school budgets?
Yeah, so something that we've been kind of focusing on, that I like to say that we set motivating goals, is like we've been prioritizing the ones that will save a lot of money for the school district first, as kind of like momentum to be like, look, we're saving all this money through our energy efficiency practices. And with that momentum, then maybe some projects that don't save as much money can kind of get passed a little bit easier as you kind of go down that road.
Great, thank you very much, Meg. I just want to take a minute and thank all of our presenters, Camille, Ariana, Mikey, Madeline, Kathy, Natalie, and Megan. Great job. You were fantastic.